Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman joins me now. Senator, it's a great honor to have you here. Is this a dream of yours to appear on Jesse Watters Primetime?
Yeah, well, because it's really my dad's dream as well too. He's going to be watching it, and of course, Dad's going to be proud.
All right, well, we're going to make Dad proud. Hi, Dad. Hi, Mr. Fetterman. Tell me about Joe Biden. 72% of the country doesn't think he's fit to serve. You do. What do you know that the rest of the country doesn't?
Absolutely. I think a lot of that hasn't really changed. I know it went up a little bit, but already America has now realized that Joe Biden is old, and he certainly isn't as sharp as he was 5 or 10 years ago. Of course, that's a reality, but that really doesn't mean much for me personally about my supporting the president. And I really don't think I've seen anything that makes me want to change that. And I would like to remind everybody watching this is that I don't need a job. I don't need anything out of this. I'm not following him blindly. But I do fundamentally believe he's been a great president, and I do believe ultimately he can prevail. And that's where I'm at.
You saw the debate, just like we all saw the debate. And that didn't change your mind about anything?
I was actually flying back from Israel at that point, and then when I landed, and I started to get some of the text, and then at that point I realized that I really wanted to get on social media and to defend our president after that, and that's what I decided to do. But of course, I mean, I know you and your viewers know that I had a really rough debate as well too.
Yes.
But I really want to remind anybody that I'm not the sum total of a bad debate.
You didn't see Joe Biden's entire debate against Donald Trump?
I didn't. I saw perhaps the most difficult ones, of course. But for me, and I know a lot of the people typically that are watching Fox, realize that Donald Trump may have had a great day and a great debate on that. But what I would like to remind people that some people thought that Donald Trump may have had some of the kinds of difficulty that perhaps Joe Biden, but he was saying things that were untrue, or he was saying things that really, I think, aren't really consistent with some of the values of a majority of people. But without a doubt that Joe Biden didn't have a great debate, but to me, I think that he's going to be our best. I think he's going. I mean, he already beat Trump, and I think this is our best opportunity to defeat Trump again.
You did have a bad debate, but you recovered, and you sound a lot better than you used to sound, and you won.
I walked in and I was like, hello and good night.
Right. Maybe just as bad as Joe Biden, but Senator.
But I knew that it was going to be rough.
Senator, you recovered, and you are younger, and you were capable of making a great recovery, as you have. Joe Biden is not in that position. Joe Biden is not in a position where he can recover. It is only going to get worse. You still trust his ability to execute the duties of Commander-in-Chief?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm not suggesting that there's going to be a Benjamin Button kind of he's going to get younger. I mean, of course, that's not going to happen. But again, it really was just a bad night. I've spent an entire year with the president for a bunch of different events all across Pennsylvania, and he was normal, and he was engaged, and he was actually very popular, and people were eager to have a selfie and those kinds of things. So I really want to remind everybody that Joe Biden has done a really good job as president, and I fundamentally am going to remain loyal to that. And I think we have some things to learn from Republicans, is that when things happen, Republicans, surround and support, and they lean in. And often Democrats, when something happens, we might want to panic, or we might argue amongst ourselves. And when I have that meeting tomorrow, I mean, I'm going to be very consistent, and I'm going to be very aggressive and defend Joe Biden.
Senator, you're going into these meetings with these Democrat senators, and a lot of them are seeming to say that this is going to be a landslide, but they don't have the courage to come out publicly and say, Joe, you got to go. Do you think they're cowards?
Without using that word, but what I will say is that anything that I will say, that's going to have my name and my face attached to that. And I'm not a leaker, and I'm not going to say something behind someone's back about this. And I really would like to remind anybody watching this too. It's like, you know, if I didn't believe Joe Biden was our guy, I'm not going to be saying some of the things that others have done publicly, but I certainly wouldn't be speaking with you about it tonight or in doing other kinds of media as well too. I would say that privately, and I'm confused when some people claim to be your friend, but if you're really a real friend, you know, you're not going to say that in a very public kind of a way, and kind of damaging things.
Obama.
So that's not the way I would do it, but because I'm very 100% on.
You're a very loyal guy, and you have honor. Obama is Joe Biden's best friend. They had their little best friend bracelets. And now Obama is sending out Clooney and Axelrod and all his speechwriters to say, Joe, step down. It's time's up. Do you think Obama is disloyal?
I don't understand. I would like to remind all, and I'm a fan of all those guys, but remember when Obama was a long shot and Clinton was supposed to run the table, and they weren't run out of their race, they got in and they held through that, and then others like say James Carville. I mean, it really wasn't about his name in that race. It was really much more about Ross Perot, and he's still living off a fish that he caught 30-some years ago on that. And it's not really helpful to damage the president. And that's not a profile in courage. You know, that's where we're at. And I'd like to remind everybody that debates really don't mean much. They really don't. I do fundamentally believe we all need to end the conversation. Joe Biden is going to be our guy. And it's going to be rough and it's uncertain, but it's going to be very close as well too. And I would just everybody watching too, watch how big the crowd is going to be of Trump in Butler. He's coming to Butler County this weekend, and I mentioned that back in 2020. Trump put 20,000 people into a rally. He's very popular in Pennsylvania. This was always going to be close, and that's the way it's going to be. Nothing's changed in a way in 2024.
When Joe Biden picked Kamala Harris as vice president, she was supposed to be the new generation. Biden was supposed to be the bridge, hand her the baton. Do you not think Kamala is qualified to be handed that baton and run?
Well, of course, if Joe, God forbid, if something happened to Joe Biden, or if Joe Biden stepped down, of course I believe she's qualified to do that. And I think she's been a great vice president. And but right now, as far as I know, I haven't heard anything that she's fallen in on Joe Biden as well too. And right now, that's a powerful team right now. And I refuse to turn our back on a great president. And I know people watching this might disagree that he hasn't been a great president, but I do believe he was. And I think loyalty is really one of the last. It's one of the last currencies in this lousy business.
John Fetterman, thank you so much for joining Jesse Watters Primetime. Tell your dad I said hello.
Thank you, and say, yeah, can I say, hey, Dad, hey, Carl Fetterman. Yeah, so thanks. It's nice to talk to you. Thank you.
Have a great night. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You won't get it anywhere else.